it from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for...
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, today is a big day for the pound in our pockets. Today we have expert analysis and comment on the Chancellor's spring statement. That, and we speak to the editor of the Kiev Post. That after your morning headlines.
Thank you. Good morning. It's 9:30. I'm Miranda Shunker in the GB newsroom. The Chancellor is expected to unveil measures to help struggling households in his spring statement today, with one measure thought to be cutting fuel duty. It's thought Rishi Sunak could raise the income threshold at which people begin to pay national insurance. Pressure is building on the government to ease the burden on the taxpayer amid the deepening cost of living crisis. Official figures show the inflation rate in February rose to 6.2%. That's up from 5.5% in January, according to the Office for National Statistics. It's the highest level in nearly 30 years. An agreement has been reached to try to evacuate civilians still trapped in cities through 9 humanitarian corridors today, according to the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister. No agreement was made for the besieged city of Mariupol, where 100,000 citizens have been left with no food, water or medicine after Putin's forces surrounded the city. Peace talks between the two sides are ongoing. P&O Ferries has insisted it didn't commit any offence by firing nearly 800 staff without notice. MPs have asked for an investigation as to whether laws were broken. But the ferry operator said all boats involved were registered outside the UK and the relevant authorities had been notified. And Australian tennis #1 Ash Barty is to retire from the sport at the age of 25. The reigning Wimbledon and Australian Open champion says she's leaving tennis to chase other dreams. She spent 121 weeks as the world #1. Well, on TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to The Briefing with Tom Harwood.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, hopefully it's not news to you today that today is a big day in the world of fiscal policy. The Chancellor is expected to make significant announcements to attempt to deal with the cost of living crisis. Of course, it was only in January that a raft of measures were announced to deal with rising energy bills. What was in Whitehall expected to be a blip, high costs as the world emerges from the pandemic and various lockdowns, as demand for energy increases as people get back to their normal lives, well, that idea of a blip, that this was a temporary problem, has been roundly put to bed by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly, energy, fuel and food costs look like they will be rising for some time to come. And the political pressure on the government to act is overwhelming. But what will the Chancellor say at 12:30 today? What are his options? Well, joining me to talk through first is some of these options is Will Tanner, previously head of policy at Number 10. Now he's director of the economic and social think tank Onward. Welcome to the programme, Will. I suppose there's an enormous amount of pressure on the Chancellor to act, particularly when it comes to energy bills. But it wasn't so long ago that he already announced a raft of measures. What more can he do?
Well, I think the watchword of today's spring statement will be security. The Chancellor needs to, on the one hand, deliver short-term security for consumers, for households, for businesses in the face of skyrocketing inflation, rising fuel prices, and indeed supply chain disruption after COVID. And I don't think we should underestimate the scale of that squeeze that's going to happen to households. You've just laid it out very clearly there, Tom, over the next few months and potentially longer. This is not necessarily the temporary blip that the Bank of England and the ONS assumed just a few months ago. This is potentially a longer term event that's going to really shape our politics for decades to come. And so I would expect the Chancellor to do things around fuel duty. We're expecting to see some reduction in fuel duty, potentially bigger than some people expect, and also a raising of the threshold around national insurance costs. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that in the face of those short-term pressures, the Chancellor also needs to do some of the longer-term reconstruction that he's always wanted to do, but has been prevented from doing by the pandemic and now Ukraine. And I suspect the Chancellor will set out some longer-term measures to make the UK economy much more competitive. Because ultimately, the way we get security in the long term is by having a much faster growing economy than we have done for the last 10 years. And for that growth to be much more broadly balanced, both regionally and generationally and between rich and poor households. And so I think the Chancellor will go quite a lot further on the kind of growth side than perhaps has been trailed in the media over the last few days.
It's interesting listening to Rishi Sunak speaking in Blackpool on Friday. He spoke about the need to encourage more investment and how that really drives growth in the United Kingdom. One thing that has been touted by a number of think tanks is this idea of the factory tax, this idea of full expensing, that we shouldn't tax firms that invest in machinery or sort of goods in order to produce their products. What's your assessment in terms of what the Chancellor is looking at there?
Well, as you know, Tom, the Chancellor last year announced something called super deductions, which was a version of full expensing, which is something that we have called for too, alongside a number of other esteemed think tanks. And the idea is that you, as you say, you allow businesses to offset their investment in machinery, plant, and potentially some digital products as well against their tax revenues. So you're incentivizing companies to do that kind of capital investment, that technological investment that really drives productivity growth. I know the Chancellor is personally convinced that that is one way we can raise our underlying rate of productivity. The problem with the super deduction tax that the Chancellor announced a few years ago is it was limited. It was only a couple of years long, and therefore the type of investments you're likely to see were the ones that were already planned before it was announced. So if the Chancellor does go further on this, and it is an expensive policy, so it would be a big step for him to do so, it would be, I think, to extend that period or potentially even make it a permanent reduction, possibly not full expensing, because that would be extraordinarily expensive, about £13 billion a year, but potentially going some way towards that. And I think that would be a very positive step to make the UK much more competitive and actually much more advantageous than reducing the headline rate of corporation tax.
Is it your assessment that the Chancellor does think we need to be more competitive, that he is worried about growth? Because, of course, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have again and again from the dispatch box said that we were the fastest growing economy in the G7 last year. And while that was true last year, The forecasts going forward do not look quite so rosy. Do you think that there's an agreement there? Do you think that there's a recognition within government that what happened last year is not likely to go ahead in future years unless there are some pretty drastic changes?
Well, so firstly, I think the Chancellor should be worried about headline rates of productivity and growth, and I think he is. The reason for that is that we've just had a decade of much slower rates of growth and productivity growth in particular than historically has been the case, about kind of half the level since 2000 and the 20 or 30 years before that. So we should be worried, and we should be taking some quite significant steps to unlock growth. But I think we should also recognise that what's happening in Ukraine and actually the aftermath of COVID, the resurgence of COVID in China, all of that will have an impact on the growth forecasts that the OBR and the Treasury look to today. And so I think it's reasonable for the Chancellor to expect there to be some downward revision and therefore to overcompensate with some policies to spur growth. And I think he's been meaning to do that for some time, waiting for COVID to end in order to do so.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the Chancellor has to say, of course, at 12:30 today, immediately following Prime Minister's questions. But for now, Will Tanner of the think tank Onward, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning. Now, to continue this conversation, joining me is the Labour MP Peter Dowd, former Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Welcome to the programme. The criticism from your party, from the Labour Party, is that this Chancellor may well appear to be a low-growth, high-tax Chancellor. He'll clearly be wanting to challenge that assumption today, pointing to the history of growth, but also potentially moving on some of these tax rises. Is that going to weaken the Labour attack line, do you think, in the future?
Well, I don't think so, because it isn't about just this Chancellor. It's also, let's be honest, it's also about previous 10 years before he became the Chancellor. So this isn't sort of, today isn't sort of, day zero, as he was suggesting yesterday. So now's the time to get on. COVID's gone. I'm afraid they were in power 10 years before COVID. So this idea that somehow, let's put all in the past, let's put all that in the past and sort of pretend we're just starting here on in, if only, I'm afraid that's not going to happen. So we've got this short-term crisis, as alluded to by your previous speaker, and of course we've got both the medium and the long-term crisis, and you've got to deal with both. And I'm not quite sure that he's managing to do either at this particular stage. And so we've got a situation where his taxes have gone up in the last 2 years by about £25 billion a year. And what have we got for it? Not a great deal. What's his plan for long-term investment? There isn't a plan for long-term investment. Your colleague, well, the previous speaker talked about low productivity. Yes, we're 35% less productive than the Germans, 25% less productive than the French, 10% less productive than the Italians. And he's really got to get to grips with that issue about slow, patient investment over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. That's how we're going to get out of this problem.
A lot of people point to the productivity issue as a number of factors. Number one, investment, as we were speaking about a little bit earlier, but also number two, housing. The fact that people can't live where they're most productive, the fact that people might want to live in bigger conurbations but have to spend hours of their day travelling to work every single day, that clearly affects productivity. Do you expect that this government might be able to do anything about housing?
That's a sort of a more longer term issue, and I think we've got that the wrong way around. What we have to do is we are also, in terms of productivity, regionally the most unequal in terms of productivity in Western Europe. So that's a long-term issue that you've got to get to grips with, and that does need investment in the infrastructure, whether it be the digital infrastructure or the rail infrastructure, for example, or in other parts of the infrastructure, like we have in Merseyside, we have turbines on the river, for example. You need that sort of massive investment over the years right across the country, both in terms of regions and in sectors. Because it's not just about regions, it's about the sectoral inequalities and productivity as well, and you've got to deal with that. Your colleague, or the former speaker, said before, in relation to tax reliefs, we already have best part of £450 billion worth of tax reliefs, and putting another tax relief into the system without a complete, thorough review of those other tax reliefs, like entrepreneurs' tax relief, and billions of pounds worth of other tax reliefs, is just going to kick the can down the road. So it's a fundamental review, for example, of that £450 billion worth of tax reliefs as well.
It is interesting talking about this from a philosophical point of view, the idea of something being a tax relief, i.e. the government choosing to not take as much money away from an individual or a business as they were doing before. Surely that's just allowing people to keep more of their money. That's not a spend from the government, that's the government taking less. That seems to be something that Keir Starmer was leaning towards, the idea that money is people's money, not government money, the idea of fiscal responsibility. Is the Labour Party trying to take some of that ground now?
I think what it's trying to say is that it has to be a fairer approach to the tax system. We've got a sclerotic tax system in this country. And as I said, the government raises about £840 billion a year out of the 2.2 trillion the country, in a sense, earns, so to speak. And it has an additional £450 billion of the tax reliefs. Now, without getting it all too complicated, you have to have a look at that structure, the structure of the tax system as well, to ensure that it is fair right across the board. That's the point. So that's why we're coming to the issue about, for example, the oil and gas companies. That's why we need a windfall tax. At the end of the day, they've been not paying a vast amount of tax, no. And in fact, when they do pay tax, they've been getting quite considerable tax reliefs on that. So there's almost like a neutral effect on the oil companies. And a final point in relation to that, we take about £2 a barrel in terms of licence off the oil companies. In Norway, in their fields, it's £17 a barrel, something like $17 a barrel. That doesn't stop the disinvestment. It's got to be fairer. It's got to be a fairer approach to tax.
I suppose the worry from some people is if it's irregular, if it's not predictable, if this country is seen to be a country that on a whim will apply a massive tax, that might be a less stable environment to invest in. I'm afraid we've run to the end of this conversation now, Peter Dowd, but I'll be delighted to have you back at any point to analyse exactly what the Chancellor says after he's said it. Thanks for joining us this morning. Now, it's day 28 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Russian troops are now inside the city of Mariupol, which has been subject to a siege for weeks. It comes, however, amid new revelations from a senior US defence official, which suggests that Russia's combat power in Ukraine is waning. Reports suggest that heavy losses of personnel and weaponry on top of morale issues amid the stalled advance to Kyiv. An estimated 3.4 million refugees have now fled the Russian invasion of Ukraine, according to the UN, with a large majority of that number being women and children. Well, joining me now is Bowdoin, chief editor of the Kyiv Post. Welcome to the programme. Thank you for making time for us this morning. While Mariupol seems to be in a very desperate situation, Kyiv seems to be holding out. What's your assessment in terms of whether or not the Russians will actually be able to take the capital?
No, the Russians won't be able to take the capital. It's quite clear that they've run out of steam. They're digging in all around the capital, many areas around it. But, it's been a complete, in English would say with the letter B, something up. And incompetence of the highest order. So yes, they've got the armor, they've got the personnel, but they haven't got the morale, the tactics, the logistical support that was needed, and the planning. As you recall, Putin and Lavrov expected this blitzkrieg would last 3 or 4 days at most. They are not being allowed into the capital. Mariupol represents what they thought was the soft underbelly of Ukraine along the Sea of Azov. And even there, in the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, with heavy Russian ethnic groups concentrated there, they've not managed to win over the support of the locals, where they've taken small towns or cities like Melitopol, Kherson. People are coming out in their thousands telling the invaders to go home. So there's an element of both demoralization, a loss as to tactics and strategy, and all that's left to them is to pound the cities with rockets and missiles, a coward's way out, as it were. So right now, I think they're stuck. And if you want my take on it, in the first days, I would have said Putin has shot himself in the foot. But I think that as a month has gone by, he's this colossus with clay feet has blown off one of its legs and is tottering right now.
It is remarkable looking at how the Western world in particular viewed Russia as sort of an erratic yet strong power. That idea that Russia is a strong power seems to be waning. They're using old Soviet kit that's breaking down. Their logistics are wavering, and indeed their soldiers' morale is so low. Many of them seem confused as to why they're even there. I wonder, thinking about what the Ukrainian people feel now, particularly those who speak Russian, who have family ties to Russia. This invasion, far from trying to unite those peoples, it's pushing them apart, is it not?
No, look, the Russian narrative is that Ukraine has always been a divided society between Ukrainian nationalists and Russian patriots. Rubbish. You know, Ukraine is a multi-ethnic country with the Ukrainians predominating, but a tolerant democratic society. Remember, our president was a Russian-speaking, Jewish by origin, elected by 73% of the population in a democratic election, mainly by the Russian speakers in the south and the east. So he represents, shall we say, the political nation that Ukraine has become, rather than one based on ethnographic, ethnocentric concepts. And what has happened is, just as in 2014, when there was the Revolution of Dignity, when we threw out a Russian-backed kleptocrat, which really annoyed the Russians because they felt that with him in power, Yanukovych, they could prevent us from moving westward. And you remember the whole Maidan, that whole Revolution of Dignity was about preventing Ukraine signing an association treaty with the EU. After that, they seized Crimea, they seized the Donbass, Russian-speaking areas, imposed their will, but at the same time, it was at the cost of uniting what was left of Ukraine, 4/5 or 5/6 or whatever it was. And this invasion has come not just as a shock, it has appalled the Ukrainian population that somebody in the 21st century can use such brutal methods, Hitler-like methods, and then to have the gall to say that they are denazifying Ukraine, a democracy that has elected 5 or 6 presidents in the last 30 years, as opposed to a country where, Putin is there forever. So when they say that, we look at them as modern-day fascists, and we're united even more by the desire to be part of the European family of nations. It's not simply an economic motive. It's not visa-free travel. It's not trade. It's about security and civilizational values. And let me just say, on behalf of my colleagues in the Kiev Post, thank you to Britain, thank you to British journalists for not only being interested, but countering fake news and for showing realities as they really are.
Well, we really try and do that here. And thank you for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. And may I just say, Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava, glory to the heroes. Ukraine will survive. It's there. We were building St. Sophia when you guys were building Westminster Abbey. We've been around a long time too. And we will be
around for a long time to come. Well, Bowdoin,
we will fight on the beaches.
Excellent. Bowdoin, Nahalo, best of luck to your people, your country, and thank you for joining us. Now, moving on back to the budget, it's officially known as the Spring Statement, but many aspects of it are seen a bit as a mini budget. This morning, the Adam Smith Institute has released a paper outlining what the Chancellor could include in his Spring Statement if he's really to go for growth and cut the cost of living. Well, joining me now is one of the authors of that paper. John MacDonald is the Director of Strategy at the Adam Smith Institute. Welcome to the programme. First of all, what are the headline measures you'd like the Chancellor to say today?
Well, I hope that rumours that the Chancellor will talk more about growth than perhaps has been discussed in the media are true, given that its policy mechanism tends to be tax and spend more often than not. I think that they should consider abolishing the NIC rise, helping people keep more of their own money, or at least raise the threshold of NIC to take the lowest paid out of paying it. I know the Chancellor says that he wants to put money back into people's pockets, but he can't at the moment. To that, I would say we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis where people have less money to spend. and what they do have buys less. If this isn't the time, I'm not sure what is. I think that in the immediate term, it's incumbent on the government to provide some sort of relief to those that need it most. So rather than clumsily doing so through cutting fuel duty or VAT, they should simply give a one-off payment, a means-tested payment of about £500 to households with a higher income without a higher income taxpayer, which would roughly be equivalent to the forecasted amount of relief that would be given through sort of various cuts to VAT or to cutting fuel duty, and have the added benefit of allowing those households to spend the money how it best suits their needs. I also think that...
Can I just jump in there, John? Because it is interesting to see a think tank on the right of politics, the neoliberal right of politics, saying that potentially the deficit right now doesn't matter so much, and what that matters more is that people have cash to spend and that we get growth up.
Well, yes, I mean, of course, tax cuts are very important, getting the deficit down, very important, but the Chancellor has about 45 billion to 75 billion of fiscal headroom to sort of mess around with here. And I appreciate that his priority is sort of making sure that we stay within the rules. But as I say, in the immediate term, the public is getting hit by a spike in inflation and a spike in energy prices. So I think that some relief will need to be provided.
Well, John, I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme there, or running to the end of it, so I'm afraid we can't delve further, but we'd be delighted to speak to you after the budget as well, after the spring statement, I should say, to go through exactly what's been announced. Thanks for joining us here. Now, just in the final minute of the programme, let's turn to GB News business and economics editor. Liam Halligan is here, and you are presenting from 11 till 4, our spring statement special here on the programme. What can we expect?
Indeed, with our colleague Gloria De Piero, we've got all aspects of economics and politics covered there. A selection of great guests coming into the studio and joining us from not only Westminster but around the country. We've got lots of regional correspondents finding out what this spring statement means to ordinary men and women, ordinary businesses, ordinary families. The thing I wanted to highlight just in the last few minutes of your programme, Tom, is this inflation number which came out this morning. It's not just that the CPI, the headline rate of inflation now is at 6.2%, up from 5.5%. That's during the year to February, 6.2%, which is a 30-year high, a new 30-year high. It's that the retail price index, a much broader measure of inflation, the rate of inflation that's used by phone companies, by train companies to upgrade your contract prices, the rate of inflation that's used by a lot of local authorities if you're paying rent on a council tax, that's at 8.2%.
Already 8.2%.
And these numbers, Tom, do not include the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict because they're numbers to the end of February, and it was only at the very end of February that ghastly invasion by Russia of Ukraine happened. So
things could get worse in short order.
We are going to see double-digit headline inflation. Inflation's good for the Chancellor in the sense he gets more tax revenue because prices go up, gets more VAT. But, of course, the public sector buys lots of things. It has to pay people. It has to buy lots of fuel. It has to buy lots of food.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, his balance sheet is squeezed.
And people's savings too. Well, we'll look forward to your programme from 11. All of the analysis that we need. Well, coming up for the next hour, it's To The Point with Patrick and Mercy. She's back from holiday. But first, it's the weather.
Hello, good morning. I'm Aidan McGibbon. A cracking start out there. Once again, chilly at first, but with widespread sunny skies, those temperatures will rise. And again, it's going to feel warm this afternoon, much warmer than you'd expect for the time of year. High pressure sitting to the east. We've again got this gentle southerly airflow. That's bringing predominantly cloud-free skies, but it's also bringing some warmth with it. Now, for the start of the day, a few fog patches, primarily across northeast England, but they lift in the next few hours. And then, for the vast majority, it's blue skies and sunshine for the rest of the day. Outside chance of a shower, for example, the north of Scotland, perhaps the east of England later on. Really the exception here rather than the rule. For the vast majority, it's blue skies, it's dry and it's warm. 15 to 18 Celsius widely. Could get 19 or 20 degrees somewhere like London, Cambridge, Manchester or the far north of Scotland. Into the evening and skies remain clear. I think we'll see a bit more of a breeze there for Cornwall at times through the day. A bit of patchy cloud as well. But thicker cloud arrives into western Scotland, the far north of Scotland and Northern Ireland, perhaps to bring a few light showers by the end of the night. Otherwise, it's clear skies as we wake up on Thursday and Another fresh start, a few fog patches, but the sun soon gets to work, lifting those temperatures, lifting the fog. And again, barely a cloud in the sky for parts of eastern Scotland into much of England and Wales. Western Scotland, Northern Ireland, seeing those thicker clouds at times through the afternoon, and seeing some spots of rain around western coasts and hills. But for the vast majority, it's dry and it's warm again, 15 to 17 Celsius generally. Now, similar weather conditions are expected on Friday and Saturday, so that means widespread